let's start off with, what we were just discussing in the last segment, which was, first off, it's Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. And we were just discussing the ongoing debate in the country in regard to critical race theory. Would you like to jump in on that conversation before we get to other topics?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things about the U.S. is that we actively oppose history and embrace myth. That is the prevailing view in the United States, that anything that is contrary to the dominant narrative gets dismissed and is replaced by some sort of mythological issue. So what that means is that periodically throughout U.S. history, we see this. There are these fights. They're essentially narrative fights. The fights about the history, how to interpret the development of the United States and what the United States is. Fights take on and on. And at the final chapter of W.B. Du Bois's iconic piece, The Black Reconstruction in America, the final chapter is called The Propaganda of History. And I encourage all leftists to read and study that chapter because what Du Bois does, and it's a great way to end the book, is to situate the attempts to revise the history of what actually happened in Reconstruction and what was going on in the motivations. And so I think what we're seeing right now is not a cultural war. This is a battle around democracy. This is a battle around how to interpret U.S. history. And the right wing is doing what the right wing is so good at, which is to take something, in this case, critical race theory, of which they know nothing, use that terminology as a way of demonizing the discussion of the truth. And for us on the left, our approach needs to be not about explaining critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the main thing. The main thing is to emphasize the truth, that we're going to be the ones that will talk about the role of slavery and settler colonialism. We're going to be the ones to talk about racism as a mechanism for social control. We will talk about the annexation of northern Mexico and what its implications have been, et cetera, et cetera. So we're the ones that are advancing the truth. And I think that we should not shy away from this battle. It is critical.
What do you make of, there's been a strange thing recently with, I found it surprising that only 14 House Republicans voted against making Juneteenth a national holiday. It seems like back in the day that would be there would be much more opposition to something like that. And I was struck by, I don't know if you saw it, you probably did it, but do you know who Madison Cawthorn is? That new young Republican rep from I think he's North or South Carolina. Anyway, he's 28 years old and he's in the House of Representatives. He was talking about the Second Amendment and guns, and he was like, the Second Amendment is to protect us against tyrannical government. And if you don't think that a few guns in a few people's hands can't stop a military machine like the United States, look at the Viet Cong and look what they did. And I'm he's just embracing this idea that the Viet Cong beat the American war machine, which is just a very strange thing for a right winger to kind of talk about. It's usually the fish called Wanda thing. We tied Vietnam at the very worst. What do you make of the right wing's? What do you make of all this? I find it very confusing and kind of new.
Okay, so there's two interesting things in which you're raising. One is that this guy got the Second Amendment, the gun issue and Second Amendment completely wrong. The Second Amendment and gun ownership, and I'd say gun fanaticism, really in the United States, is directly connected to settler colonialism and to racial slavery. It's not about protecting people from a tyrannical government. It was that beginning in the 1600s, so-called whites had to have guns. That was part of the colonial culture and system. They had to have guns as well for the purpose of ensuring the suppression of slaves and for the acquisition, and I'm using that word very politely, of land from the indigenous. I mean, that's what it was about. The Second Amendment as such was just more the gravy on that. It wasn't about protecting people from a tyrannical government. So that's one thing. I think it's real. And again, this is something that Roxanne Dunbar Otis has written about extensively. It's very well documented and really important for us on the left to point out. Now, the first part of what you're raising, though, is interesting. Why didn't more, not that the last part wasn't, but why didn't more of these right wingers vote against it? And I think for cynical reasons, I think it was for many of them a throwaway, that they would be able to later say, while they're suppressing our voting rights, that they're really not racist because, look, they supported Juneteenth. I don't think that we should make much of it. I think that it's good that this act passed. I think it's part of the battle around how we understand history. That people would do it for cynical reasons. Welcome to the United States.
Right. Well, since we're on the topic of the right wing and its messaging, there has been this very clear trend of right wingers since the Trump administration to pay lip service to the economic anxieties that Americans are facing. Mm-hmm. Some are referring to it as right wing populism. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important to kind of tackle that head on and really unpack what that messaging is really about. Because while we on the left have we have a very clear analysis of capital and what we want to do about changing the system, their solutions tend to be very different. So can you discuss that?
So, thank you. So first, Trump and the Trump phenomena builds off of, well, one could say 500 years, but at least 50 years of a reconfigured right wing. And when there's this famous quote from Lyndon Johnson, who said after signing either the 64 Civil Rights Act or the 65 Voting Rights Act, I don't remember which, he said, the Democratic Party has lost the South for at least a generation. And as it turned out, he was optimistic. And that the shift that we start to see away from the Democratic Party by large numbers of whites precedes the economic downturns that we start to see in evidence in the 1970s. It's part of the Republican Party becoming the non-Black party. So part of what the Trump phenomena was building off of this trend. Another part, though, was very interesting for the Republican Party because he was making arguments that were very much akin to the Polish right-wing populists who are in power, the Justice and Freedom Party, I believe it's called, that identifies themselves as supporters of the welfare state, but their idea is that they support the welfare state for what they see as the legitimate population, that is, for the so-called Poles as opposed to anyone else. And so there's this element within Trump of speaking to both the demographic changes underway in the United States, the political victories, the victories for democracy that have been won over the 20th century, as well as aspects of neoliberalism and the declining living standard for most working people, the fear, particularly in middle and upper income, among upper income whites, of being squeezed between the rich and the poor. Trump was able to play to that. And what was interesting is that in doing so, he overturned much of the rhetoric of the Republican Party. Your point is also important because what the right wing does, what Trump and others have done, is when they do seize on economic grievances or economic stress, their answers are either openly regressive, like let's return to the 1950s, or they focus on scapegoats, scapegoating Jews, scapegoating African Americans, scapegoating immigrants, scapegoating women, etc. And that's one of the reasons that we on the left have to be very clear that sometimes we will hear these right-wingers say things that will almost sound like us, but it's not. And there's no middle ground between us and them. This is a fight to the finish.
You know, if I may, I have one quick follow-up to that, Nando. So I think what you're saying is so important because, you know, there is, I think, an accurate mission for the left to build broad coalitions. And what I'm noticing right now, even though the left is fractured in the United States, and we need to have a discussion about uniting amongst us, but is this notion that for all these right-wingers who are uttering, you know, populist language, maybe we can work with them. Maybe they can be part of the coalition. What is your response to that?
Oh, I'm almost sorry you asked me that question. Because that, I mean, I think that it's a really great question. And my answer is that we have to proceed very carefully. And in most cases, well, I shouldn't put it like that. We have to proceed very carefully. And I'll give you an example. So when the Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game from Atlanta because of Georgia instituting these voter suppression statutes, these right-wingers basically said, now is the time to take on the antitrust exemption that Major League Baseball has had since the 1920s, that has allowed the baseball industry to basically be a monopoly. Now, up until this moment, they have refused to even touch that issue. Now, in retaliation for the MLB taking steps in response to voter suppression, they want to take this on. Well, there's some people that have felt, well, okay, let's unite with them. I would say, no, not so fast. Because what I'm not interested in is what is called in Europe red-brown alliances. That is aligning between the left and fascist or fascist-leaning folks, believing that we actually share something in common. With those organized folks, we do not. We may share things in common with people who are in the middle, people who are confused and vacillating. But for the organized right wing around something like this, I think we have to be very, very careful. Now, having said that, here's the paradox. I'm working now around the issue of the Western Sahara and the opposition to the Moroccan occupation. For a peculiar set of historical reasons, there's a whole set of Republicans that are very much opposed to the Moroccan occupation. And I work with them. And we work fine as long as we don't talk about anything else. So I think that this is a matter of proceeding carefully and trying to understand the motives of any of these folks on the right and whether it's something that strengthens us or in fact strengthens them.
I wanted to pass along a question that came from the audience in form of a super chat. They write, Juneteenth becoming a holiday is important, but it's arguably an example of performative instead of material change, such as reparations. Should the left be emphasizing that it's not enough, or should we just take the win?
Well, it's interesting that you raise that, Nando, because I've been having these debates for the last 24 hours on Facebook around Juneteenth. And some of it has gotten actually quite ugly.
Shocking.
Yeah, really, I know. There's gambling in the house. So you know, I would say that the point of view that the left should adopt is that this is a victory and it's not enough. And we have to keep on pressing forward. I think that I picked up some of what you were saying, the two of you were saying earlier. I'm very worried about cynicism. And there's too much on the left that promotes cynicism, and that there's no victories that are legitimate unless we get the final victory. I mean, that's essentially the message that comes through, which is very unsettling for our base. Because if that is true, then people should just simply get high and wait, right? Because I mean, that's essentially what people are being told. And I think that this Juneteenth victory is a victory. Yes, it is symbolic, but it's important that it comes at this moment when we're having this debate about the history of the United States. And that's what we need to be seizing on. Just like Du Bois took on the whole question of the Reconstruction era and went after the forces on the right, we need to be going after the forces on the right who are saying things like, there should be no teaching of history that makes someone feel guilty or uncomfortable because of their race and gender, right? We need to be taking these people on. We need to be taking on people that are arguing that a correct understanding of the Texas Revolution, so-called, of 1836, is that it was led by slave owners and by other charlatans. And it wasn't a glorious revolution of some sort. We need to be taking these things on. And so I think that the Juneteenth is an opportunity to do that. Did it bring us everything that we want? Of course not, right? But why should that even be a surprise? So I don't think that, I guess there's one other thing that someone pointed out on Facebook that I appreciated, which is that there are people that have been out there for years fighting to turn Juneteenth into a national holiday and have seen the significance of this. And I don't think you write that off. I don't think you say that that's irrelevant any more than you would say that Martin Luther King's birthday becoming a national holiday is irrelevant.
I share your on the topic of cynicism. I think that we're seeing a lot of that lately, especially in the wake of Bernie's defeat and Biden's great victory. It seems like for the left there is a very seductive instinct to say, to grapple on with the idea that the whole thing was a fraud from the beginning. And that what was the point, that it was all just a fraudulent thing, when it really it wasn't fraudulent. It's just we just lost. Right. Sometimes most times you lose. Right. So it's just that cynicism. I mean, I find myself sometimes in my darker moments succumbing to it, especially when you have an analysis of the situation that runs kind of deep in structure. You're like, oh my God, look at all these. Like, how are we gonna, if we couldn't do it then, like, how are we gonna do it? But, how do you kind of overcome that?
So I think that we all have those moments. I know I have. And there's certain moments when I say, why didn't I become an entertainment lawyer? Or, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in Monte Carlo? Right?
Yeah.
So,
a lot of traffic.
Yeah, but I want to see the Grand Prix every year. So everyone says this, and I think that that's fine. I think it's different though, and I think that to deny that people feel that is irrational. We feel that we have suffered many defeats. The odds are against us, and yet we keep fighting, and we have to. So I think that we have to convey certain things in private and with our comrades and friends. I think what I get angry about is what has happened on social media, where people have no filters, and they say whatever the hell is on their mind, whether it's about an internal squabble in an organization or about disparaging this Juneteenth. And I think that we have to take a stand against that. I think it's really harmful that cynicism is never progressive. Cynicism can sometimes appear to be revolutionary, but cynicism always leads to demobilization. And that's what we have to really emphasize within our ranks. So I don't do well with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched on something that really, really resonates with me in regard to social media, because it's not just about sharing a cynical perspective on what's happening in the country. There's also a very clear incentive to sow division, right?
Yes.
And so it's not just Twitter and Facebook, but I mean YouTube, any platform where you can monetize content, right?
Right.
I'm noticing this very clear divide based on who's willing to exploit the algorithm, which incentivizes and rewards division and conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it's part, well, first, let me ask you, do you feel that that's playing a significant role in fracturing the left in the US?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a combination of postmodernism and this technology. So, so the technology and the expansion of social media builds off of a virus that I think clearly emerged during the Reagan era, and it's this heightened individualism, entrepreneurialism that has even affected left-wing circles, so that people are into self-promotion as opposed to collective promotion. It's all about me and positioning me. And making sure that I have my picture here or my poem there or song or whatever, as opposed to the notion of the collective. And this has really been eroding our movement. I mean, it's odd because you'll have people that will self-identify on the left, but are incredible individualists and self-promoters. And we see that tearing our movement apart. So I think there's that, but there's another thing that is related, which I tie in with postmodernism, and I see it on in the racial realm, where you have this sort of exclusivity. It relates sort of to the Afro-pessimism that you were talking about before, which is that that, for example, that there is no one that can really understand what Black people go through. There is no other oppression that is like ours. Therefore, no analogy should ever be drawn. And basically everybody's against us, which is what it really comes down to. And so, there's a historical problem with that entire analysis, but two, what that ends up doing is becoming completely self-defeating, because it's basically saying that there's no basis for alliances. There's no basis for building any kind of common block, that we're on our own. And you see that not just with Black folks, you see that in other struggles, which I definitely tie directly in with postmodernism. So all of these things together really do act at fragmenting our movement. And I find it, frankly, very scary. I mean, I was saying to my wife this morning, and I say this probably about once a week, I often wonder whether I should just abandon Facebook, because I find this stuff so obnoxious. And then trying to decide, all right, Fletcher, you write a lot. How much is worth your time responding to nincompoops? And it's like, it's like a lot of these people, do they have a base? Are they a robot? Right? Are they sitting, in some cabin in Maine? Or, I mean, like, who are they? And I don't know. I it's very discouraging.
Well, I guess the question would be like, how do we move to postmodernism and get out of this kind of individual self-absorption that we all are guilty of? I am guilty of it as well. I am a product of our time as much as anyone else. How do we overcome it outside of taking a trip out to Monte Carlo to watch the Grand Prix, which we should do regardless, even if
absolutely.
It has no political goal.
No, we should, and we should make arrangements on that.
Yeah.
And so one is that I want to encourage people to look at the piece that I wrote in Monthly Review that Anna, you so graciously announced, The Modern Tecumseh and the Future of the U.S. Left, because that is a partial attempt to address what you're raising. I think going full circle, this is why the battle around history becomes so important. And it is actually why I did spend a fair amount of time the last day responding to people on Juneteenth. Because you see, I think the right understands narrative. We don't, by and large. We on the left tend to think in terms of facts and throwing facts at people, and that will bring everything together. What the right understands is the importance of a narrative linked with struggle. So they are at one and the same time carrying out a battle around history through the anti-critical race theory stuff, at the same time that they're engaging in voter suppression. And these two things are absolutely linked. It's not that they're doing one or the other, they're doing both at the same time, and they reinforce one another. Their narrative on history suggests that there are entire populations that are illegitimate, that have undermined US elections, and truth be told, should never be voting. And therefore, they need to have laws that enforce that, but they need to have a storyline that reinforces that point, and a storyline that attacks the truth. So our job then becomes asserting the truth, fighting very courageously and quite openly around how to understand US history, including how did capitalism develop. You know, you were mentioning before this whole thing about the original sin concept, and where people will say the original sin is slavery. And I say, well, the original sin is actually settler colonialism and slavery. But if people mean original sin as something that can never be changed, then I agree with you that that is really backward. If, on the other hand, what they mean is that this is central to how one understands the creation of the US state, then it is essential that people get that. And as opposed to falling prey to myth.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of myth, now that Juneteenth is a holiday, some are concerned, and I think are justified in their concern, that the history of Juneteenth will be watered down. That tends to happen.
Yes.
And so, can you just discuss the real historical meaning of Juneteenth for our audience?
So, thank you. So, in the Civil War, the thing to keep in mind always is that the North, and Lincoln in particular, was trying to do everything that they could do to avoid the Civil War. And they were trying to, ultimately when the war started, conduct the war on the basis of bringing the Union back together, but not touching slavery. The problem was that the slaves had a different idea. So when the war started, and Du Bois documents this in the beginning of Black Reconstruction, he has what he called the Great General Strike. That in effect what happened is that hundreds of thousands of African slaves abandoned plantations, abandoned other forms of work, and started walking to the front lines where the Union troops were confronting the Confederates. And that this really obstructed the war effort of the Confederates. When Lincoln finally concludes that the war needs to take on the issue of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation is, in effect, a noble document, but it's a compromise document because it basically freed the slaves that the Union did not control. And so you then go through a period from 1863 to 1865 where the war increasingly takes on the character of a liberation war or an emancipation war. Greater numbers of African former slaves are enlisting or in other ways supporting the Union war effort, and it's fracturing the Confederacy. The Confederacy can't do this. And on top of that, there was growing international support for the Union and opposition to slavery. English workers, for example, refused to unload cotton that was coming from the Confederate South, even though that was against their immediate material interests. The Russians at that time expressed their support for the federal government. So you had this convergence of forces. When Lee surrenders in Appomattox in April of 1865, the Civil War does not end. It starts to wind down, and it ends slowly over several months. So when Union troops reached Texas in June of 1865, Texas had not been basically touched by Union troops during the Civil War. So the Union troops arrive, many of them African soldiers, who then spread the word about emancipation, that emancipation had come, slavery was over. So in effect, Juneteenth is symbolizing the formal end of slavery. And I would say, in addition, the victory of an emancipation war. And that's the thing that I would want to emphasize and why I keep coming back to Du Bois and his brilliant analysis, and particularly what he says about the Great General Strike.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it. Bill Fletcher Jr., thank you so much for joining us and enlightening us with your wisdom. The real history of Juneteenth. I mean, I cannot wait until it just gets turned into like I don't know, like it was like all just one big happy family that just, we just did a thing and then it was all over. No violence, no nothing. It was just it was very civil and polite.
Or a sale event for retailers.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. Well, that's already happening.
It will. Think about Labor Day. I mean, it's just, think about Martin Luther King's birthday. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's why, as opposed to what we often do, which has become very passive, we have to keep pushing, not just the larger demands, but pushing to remind people, what does this day symbolize?
Right. Well,
thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
They can send their friends this episode and they will know.
Yeah. All right, here we go. Thanks very much and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too.